Hi, I'm Tony Russo, and this is Funeral Service Insider from Kates-Boylston. Each episode features conversations about emerging trends and news that affect the death care industry. We talk to people who understand the delicate balance of change in a profession and vocation steeped in tradition. This week, I'm speaking with Faith Haug, who runs the Mortuary Science program at Arapahoe Community College in Littleton, Colorado. I reached out to Faith a long time ago because I wanted to see, what was going to happen if and when Colorado started to regulate and enforce the regulations in its funeral industry, and of course, what kind of big boost in attendance she expected to see. And that is not what the conversation ended up being, because those aren't really the issues in Colorado. Instead, we have a great conversation about mortuary school in general, and it's kind of kicked off this conversation where you're going to be hearing a lot more about mortuary school things from us here at FSI, both in the magazine and on the podcast. This was supposed to be an interview about two different things, but the mortuary piece was so interesting that we put the other part on hold, so we teased something that we never get back to, so I apologize for that in advance. The story that she didn't get to tell on this episode is in Funeral Service Insider if you're a subscriber. And if not, we'll have her back on, sometime in the fall. I know that she'll be giving her grief talk again in October sometime, so maybe in advance of that. Two quick things before we get started. The first is I'm going to be doing more on mortuary school. So if you are in mortuary school, or you teach mortuary school, or you have any strong opinions about what can or cannot, should or should not be going on at mortuary school, please reach out to me and let me know what they are. My email address is arusso, R-U-S-S-O, at K like kitten, B like boy, publications, PUBLICATIONS.com. And I'm going to be putting them together for a larger project. The second thing is, as always, please hang on after the credits for the postmortem. This week, we're going to be talking about coverage of the LGBTQIA plus community. Now, let's talk to Faith. So in the feature that we did on you in Funeral Service Insider, when I called to do it, my story was, oh my God, Colorado's changing the laws, and the only school in the state is going to be bombarded. And you told me how pointedly wrong I was.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about, the culture of education in Colorado, and
Sure.
how it's kind of continued through the last 30 years or 20 years?
Sure. Well, I mean, the mortuary school has been in the state for right about 30 years. It's nothing new. And, we haven't had licensing in Colorado for 40 years. That has just passed very recently and should be signed by the governor in the next 2 or 3 weeks here. So, it's changing some things, but no, I absolutely don't expect any kind of increase in applicants. We already have more than enough applicants every year. We're a very popular program, as I think I told you in another interview. But, the way that the bill is written, it's written specifically to not require the people who haven't gone to school to have to go to school. So it's really just forward based with that. So any people new to the industry as of the effective date will have to go to school. But just because you enact licensing doesn't mean you're going to have a whole bunch of new people wanting to enter an industry that wouldn't have before. So this idea that now that there's licensing, all these people are going to have to go back to school, that's just not the case. That's not how the bill is written. There won't be anyone that's currently working in funeral service that has not gone to school is not going to have to.
And the other thing that you told me that was surprising was that about half of your students are not in state anyway. Can you talk to me a little about your remote program? Because that's fascinating to me, especially when it comes to embalming.
Sure. Yeah. Our program's the first to have a fully online program. About half, maybe a little, it depends on the year, but right around half every year are from other states, and even in-state students attend almost fully online. It's more convenient for people. It allows them to still be able to work full time while they're in school. And I would say 90% of our students, whether they're in state or out of state, are online students. So, we serve all states. We have students from pretty much every state or have, in the nation, and will probably continue to do so. We're a very popular program for a lot of reasons, and one of those is our online option.
And about how many students do you have per semester?
About 100 to 150.
And you said you get a lot more apply for that.
Correct. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we admit about 30% of applicants.
And one of the things that we were talking about also was the curriculum, and you have added like a green piece to your curriculum to accommodate. Can you tell me about so you're running the show. How long have you been running the show there?
2 years.
And were those your decisions, or were those things that you
Yes.
inherited? And can you tell me, did you get any pushback?
No, not at all. I mean, I'm in charge of the program, so there's nobody to push back, really. I mean,
Not the administration or anything.
No, not at all. Not at all. No, in the last 2 years, I've made significant changes to our program, as far as, additions of things that weren't already part of the curriculum. And that needed to happen. And it needs to happen in other schools, quite frankly. But yeah, I mean, you have to stay relevant, and the entire purpose of going to school is that you're up to date on industry developments and things that are actually happening in the industry. And so I added a lot of things, and we have green burial, natural burial, water cremation, alkaline hydrolysis, natural organic reduction. We teach about all those things. We have guest speakers about all of those things. We do a lot of things in that space.
Now, when you decide to add these things, do you have to write this curriculum yourself? Is it stuff that you just bring, I guess, as someone who has been in the industry for long enough, you kind of know day to day what people need to know?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of know what people need to know, but our current curriculum doesn't. I mean, our current official curriculum for our accrediting, body includes very, very little about these topics. And so it's all supplemental information, that's added, and that's okay. So I haven't changed any of the, curriculum that we're required to teach by any means. I've just supplemented it with things that are relevant, specifically to 2024 and the part of the country that I live in. And that's not even such a big thing anymore, because these options are available all over the United States. It's not just a Colorado thing or a Western thing. And so we have got to, educate our students on what's really going on out there.
And as I was teasing you a little bit before we started about how famous you are, I've spoken with people incidentally who always speak very highly of you. So you're obviously a respected person in your field. Can you tell me how you got to where you are? Like what was your path to get to funeral service and then beyond into education?
There's no story. I just wanted to be a funeral director. It's just that simple. I don't have any kind of something didn't happen to me. I didn't see some movie or have some experience. I just was born for it, I guess. It's just kind of what I wanted to do. And so I went to mortuary school. I graduated from Worsham. I started my career as an intern, like we all do, most of us. And, was a licensed funeral director and embalmer for a long time. I ended up transferring into organ and tissue donation. I was the funeral liaison for Colorado and Wyoming for a number of years. And then in early 2022, I came into the education world.
And one of the things that is really interesting to me about your career is that you kind of always want to do something new, is probably not the way to put it, but you seem to be looking for challenges.
I seem to be looking to make our industry relevant, and it's something that every podcast, every magazine, everything funeral service related, every conference, that's been a topic of discussion for at least a decade. How the industry's changed, how are we going to stay relevant? And it's not that difficult. We just have to do the things we say we're going to do. And so I just do them, I suppose, is the best way to put it. I'm not really looking to make any kind of statement or prove any kind of point, but I see the writing on the wall, and I choose to operate in reality instead of the past.
That's the tough thing is this. They talk about a fear of change, and I don't know if it's a fear of change so much as it's uncomfortableness with having to break your template. Because once you're working in a template, it's just really easy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the fear of change, the change is old news. I mean, the change has happened. What are we afraid of? It's happened. So it's not something looming, it's happening. It's happened. So it's maybe it's a fear of reality, or it's a not, unwilling to accept reality more than a fear of change.
That is so salient. I just did several stories on funeral directors in the news for negative reasons,
Mhm.
mainly floating their business on their pre-need
Mhm.
for longer
Mhm.
than for longer. And that's what it is. It really does seem like they're living in denial. I was speaking
Mhm.
about Succession. I had just done a story about Succession, and I was speaking. It was Chris Kruger, and he's like, a lot of times
Mhm.
people, they just don't want to deal with the idea that they're going to have to give up their business, and
Right.
then you see these guys just crash and burn.
Mhm. Yeah.
Right. I guess that's the long way of saying I very agree with you about it's just something that you have to get up and do rather than continue to talk about.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, good grief, cremation is as old as time. We've been cremating, I mean, essentially before we've been doing anything else. So when I hear cremation, like, can we stop talking about cremation being new and disruptive to the industry? I mean, my gosh, that is thousands and thousands of years old. And it just goes to show that we will latch on to something as the enemy that has always existed, in an effort to justify not wanting to accept reality.
Oh, that is very well put. Yeah, I guess that's why. I guess that's why you're so popular among your
Maybe.
former
And
students.
it's not, it's not and truly I love funeral service, and I guess I mean, people have this idea of me. A lot of it's, because I do say the things, and I'm covered in tattoos and piercings, and how people feel about that. But really, I love the history of our profession in the United States, but we didn't invent funeral service, you know. So
Right.
we have a very short memory in the history of humankind as to what death care and funeral service is, and we really only look at our own history as a country and forget that there was time before the Civil War, before embalming and funeral service didn't start in the Civil War period, and so we can't. In what so many people say, we can't forget our history. We can't forget our history. Well, that extends beyond just traditional Christian funeral service with embalming. Our history goes back to Egyptians, to Greeks, to Romans, to Aztecs. I mean, that's all our history too. But we only want to think of our history as American history from 1850 onward.
Yeah, I guess a chapter on ritual cannibalism probably wouldn't
Sure.
fly.
Not at all. Not at all. But, the point being that we cling to our history as a profession, but what we're really clinging to is our American Christian history of a profession, not our history of a profession. Any longer than that, it seems like, we teach Egyptian things, and then we it's like it goes from Egyptian times to 1850s. And there's a
Right.
whole lot of stuff that happens before and after then too, that we like to forget about, maybe because it's inconvenient or it's just not as interesting. So really, I guess that's what I mean by staying relevant, and kind of the things that I like to bring into the classroom and teach is bigger, broader perspectives beyond just the narrow focus of American funeral service, American Christian white funeral service specifically.
And I guess your students really kind of take that to heart. And they're one of
Hmm.
the things that I've been really interested in is young funeral directors who are like, you know what, I'm not going to even, I don't want to say not even bother, but I'm
Hmm.
going to make my own way. I want to do
Hmm.
it this way. I'm going to find a
Yeah.
place that will let me.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, and every area, I mean, and if every demographic is different, every part of the country serves different kinds of people. But even if you're in, the most conservative part of the country, the most conservative Christian part of the country, there's still families there that don't fit that mold that need to be served. And so, our students are willing to do that, and they don't see funeral service in this tiny little narrow tunnel view of kind of that. And I keep coming back to it because this is something that it was a small conversation I had with a dear friend of mine not a couple weeks ago, just a comment. But she is Jewish, and she's worked at a Jewish funeral home for 15 years. And she was questioning an article that kept calling green burial non-traditional. And she kept saying, what is traditional? And I said, the reason we use the word traditional, what we think we mean is embalming. What we actually mean, and we don't realize it, is white Christian funeral service. That's the traditional we're talking about when we say traditional service. And so it's tied to religion. It's not tied to embalming necessarily. And so, but really, the point being is that the students don't see funeral service as you do this and you do this and it goes this way, and anything outside of that is non-traditional. They see themselves as death care professionals, and they want that education and they want that experience to be much more broad and comprehensive. And while I 100% teach the curriculum I'm supposed to per our accrediting body, as every school that's accredited does, one of the things that I do strive to do is bring in supplementary information and supplementary access to things that do give them a broader, bigger perspective than just we take the casket down the aisle in mass, and that's one thing of a million different things that your career could be.
And thank you. I'm sorry you threw me
What?
off. No, you're just so eloquent. I just want you to keep talking, and I'll just sit here and keep my mouth.
I talk all day. That's why people either love me or they hate me, and this is why, because I'll say the things and I'll say them with a little bit of intelligence and education and fact behind it. So if you want to come to the table and talk to me or debate with me, let's go. But come prepared.
As the death care profession evolves with rising consolidations and cremation rates, funeral homes face new challenges. Welton Haug, CEO of Ring Ring Marketing, delves into how digital marketing can be a game changer in generating more calls and standing out in a competitive market in Boosting Funeral Home Calls, Mastering Digital Marketing in 2024, a Kates-Boylston webinar slated for 2 p.m. Thursday, July 11th. The session will demystify online marketing while showing how to maximize returns without wasteful spending. Key focus areas include dominating local search, leveraging 5-star reviews for credibility, and attracting pre-need business. Haug will share practical insights on optimizing your online presence, understanding the importance of authentic reviews, and strategies for capturing pre-need opportunities. This talk isn't just theory. It's about actionable steps to elevate your funeral home in the digital realm. Prior to starting Ring Ring Marketing, Haug was a senior technologist at R&D facilities for Intel, Sun Microsystems, and Oracle. He speaks regularly at conferences and other events for people in the death care industry. I have to say, I spoke with Welton for a preview of his upcoming talk, and we had a great conversation. We hope to get that to you soon. But in the meantime, sign up for this webinar. It will be worth your time, I assure you. Go to Kates-Boylston.com and click on webinars, or just click the link below. Or just click the link in the show notes. So something that I wrote down a couple minutes ago when you said it was that there are families that need to get served that aren't really getting served in some places. And yours has become one of them. And
yes,
it's kind of brought you into this idea of grieving the living, or how to grieve the living. And what's really interesting about that to me is I'm fascinated with the idea of the end of life approach rather than just the death care approach. This idea that we are living toward dying, and we may as well recognize it. So would you mind sharing your story real quick and then telling us about how you speak about grief in a more encompassing way because of your experiences?
Sure. Yeah, of course. You did say something I just want to touch on about how it's really a piece of end of life care, and that's so true. And part of one of the things in my program that my students are exposed to, and I this is a topic for another podcast because I have feelings about some of these things.
Okay.
But how do we work with people like death doulas or with people like hospice groups, or because we've really sequestered ourselves into this little tiny narrow picture, piece of the picture, when it is so much bigger than that. And I have feelings about death doulas and what their true scope should be, as many of us do. But I think that we have got to again look at our career as funeral directors or whatever, more in a broader sense of we are death care professionals, and not pigeonhole ourselves into, no, we pick the body up, we prepare it, and we do something with it, and that's all we do. Because what's happening is families don't want that anymore. And other people are out there giving them what they want. And if we aren't willing to be those people, guess what? Somebody else is going to take it from us. And that's what's happening. And so our hesitancy to allow anybody else into that death care space. And again, I have the caveat of, I do think that there's qualifications and education and things that anyone needs to operate professionally in death care. But when we other everyone else that works in that space and consider ourselves better or above or more important or more whatever, we're going to lose families to other types of care because we're not willing to be involved in it. And that's just a warning. So that's what our true thing we should fear is, not cremation, not reduction, not blue-haired, tattooed, people. We should fear the fact that we're not willing to exist in the spaces that our families are telling us that they want us to exist in, and then someone else is going to exist there, and we're going to be irrelevant.
At the risk of plugging, not at the risk, I'm about to plug a future story that I'm working on now. I interviewed a young woman. She's in her first semester at mortuary school, and she's going to mortuary school to legitimize her death doula and end of life business.
I love that. Death doulas, I have friends that are death doulas. There's good ones. There's just like funeral directors. There's good ones and ones that aren't. I'll just say it. I don't think a 3-hour class on a Saturday makes you a qualified death care professional. I don't. But I think that what the work the death doulas do is important and valuable to people, and mortuary school is for death doulas. We're not enemies. We're just different parts of the process. And that's where I think that's the future, really, is a more comprehensive, holistic death care experience. And if we are unwilling as a profession to engage in those practices and to work with those people, we're going to regret it.
And so what are some of the things, I'm going to derail this whole conversation because this is more fun anyway. So what are the things some other, I've spoken with a lot of, I was mentioning before, so I've spoken with a lot of teachers who are doing this very thing. And what is a way that we can do a better job at getting the word out that if you want to be a death doula, maybe consider, like, what are the benefits of mortuary schools for death doulas?
I would, and again, full disclosure, we are an accredited program through the American Board of Funeral Service Education, and we intend to stay that way.
Yes.
But what I wish we could do, and I think we can, I think we just have to be willing to, is open up our own eyes as educators and as an industry to all of the different things that are relevant to death care, and be willing to see the education that we provide as relevant to those people. So I tell my students, and somebody may not like this, but it's true. I tell my students, by graduating from this program and getting a degree in mortuary science, you are not sentenced to a life of wearing a suit and standing opening doors for people in a funeral home. That's not it. You are getting a comprehensive education in so many different areas that you can take and work in so many different ways in death care, at large. So I think mortuary school is for people that want to maybe go on into coroner work or organ and tissue donation and transplantation, or death doula work, or hospice, or really anybody that wants to work in the death care space can benefit from the mortuary school education. We have to stop seeing it as it's funeral service and we are training. What I don't like is the idea that mortuary school is a trade school teaching people the tasks of how to be funeral directors. That's one of
I'm
the
sorry.
things. Go ahead.
That was what I have. What I've written down here was my impression so far, up until the last 6 or so months, was that
Mhm.
a lot of the mortuary school curriculum was an excuse around the embalming courses. Like, you have to learn to embalm, and you have to learn how to handle all the bodies and things like this. But that's not enough to earn you a degree. We have to add stuff on top of it.
I think, if
And
I'll be honest with you, I think that's how it started. I think there's a lot of truth. I
yeah,
don't think it's that simple, but I think that we decided we wanted to have we started as embalming schools. That's what they were called. I
right,
mean, yeah, sure. And then, we decided we were going to, well, make education a business, and then then that's not unique to funeral service. That's every
right.
industry,
No,
right? So, I mean, people were doing every profession before there was education to be had for that profession. And I'm critical of education as an educator and as a student myself, because my God, why does it cost $30,000 to get an associate degree? But that's a conversation for another time. I guess what I would like to see here's my dream. If I'm going to expose my dream to everyone that's listening, I would love to see a program at my school, or another, but at my school probably, where it is a death studies degree, and these degrees exist, in other places, but where it's the same curriculum essentially as mortuary school, and then the embalming is optional. If you want to learn the embalming process and all of that, those classes are available to you, and then you graduate with a degree in mortuary science and go on and do whatever. But there's no reason that a person wouldn't benefit from every other class in that curriculum, and could then have, a death studies degree that they could take on and further specialize in, through advanced education, in grief counseling, in science of some way. There's so many things in the curriculum that someone can take and further specialize in, that we need in the industry. So whether you go on and get a license as a social worker, or as a grief therapist, or as some kind of hospice professional, or whatever it is, I really do think that the mortuary science curriculum is an excellent foundation and a great start. And what turns people off right now that might otherwise do it is the requirement of learning the embalming. And so, kind of the reason that mortuary school started is now the reason that some people choose not to go when maybe they otherwise would in a lot of places.
because imagine, like, we have a lot of thanatologists that speak.
Yes.
Thanatologists are all over the place, and there's, as you said, there's no reason that couldn't be part of a larger death end of life degree.
Absolutely. And embalming can be part of that. But again, here's what we do. We try to gatekeep so much of what we do as funeral service providers, and then when other people start doing it, like, we don't know what to do about it. We have to, like, take it back. It belong if we think it belongs to us, then it belongs to us, fine, but then we have to be the ones willing to educate and work with other people.
And I don't want to be twee about it, but there is this calling
Mhm.
that funeral directors have,
Mhm.
and that is different, and that's different from getting a job.
Mhm.
And I think that's the kind of thing that when people say, "Well, I have a calling to serve people in death, but I don't have a calling to do the embalming piece,"
Sure.
you're missing out on people who could do so much good for so many people.
Absolutely.
And the
And
odds of them even needing to be in the embalming room are
well,
slim to none. Eh?
yeah, and a little part of me still says it's one class out of like 15. Just take the class and never do it. What's the big deal? Some people, and an interesting thing about embalming, I hear from a lot of students after they've been through the embalming classes, is that embalming is so much different than they thought it was. And they're very glad that they took those classes, and they were apprehensive about it. They didn't think they ever wanted to be in a prep room, but they had to take the class and do the embalmings, to graduate. And once it's done,
Mm.
they're so glad that they did, even if they never intend to practice as an embalmer, because it does just give you more knowledge and information about things. So one of the things that bothers me a little bit, is the people that did not go to mortuary school. Most often it's death doulas or other, people that work in death care and other spaces, speaking so negatively about embalming. And it's like, have you ever taken an embalming class, or been an embalmer, or is this just like things that's regurgitated and that you believe is fact? Because I've heard some crazy things about the embalming process from people that have never been in a prep room. And so while, I do think that having an education available, I think mortuary science education is for anybody that wants to work in death care in any capacity. I really do. And if the embalming piece is the piece that's keeping people out of it, then maybe, another degree program for those people is a way to go. But also, guys, take the embalming class, learn what it is and what it really isn't, and then, make your decision. You don't have to, just because you take embalming class as part of a degree program, doesn't mean you're turning your back on anything natural or that you're doing anything wrong. All it is giving you more education information about something that then you can, use to your benefit. Hopefully, it doesn't mean you have to go work in a prep room. So I see it both ways. I'm kind of like, what's the big deal? Just take the class. Like, it's fine. And the other part of me is, well, if that's really what's keeping people out of death care that could otherwise be in it, well, maybe we have to look at that too.
Well, because there's also, ritual washing. You want to know
Sure.
how to handle a
You
human being.
do, and the argument becomes, well, we inherently know how to take care of our own people, and I don't think that's wrong. I don't think that's wrong because, again, mortuary science education has only existed for a couple of generations, and we were taking care of dead people since humans existed. So, obviously we can figure out how to do things or do other things because we did up until, very modern times. But there are things you can learn from a formal education that can make you better at it. And I think that there's value in an education around things like, just the process of decomposition, the science of it, the ways, that a body can be treated that don't include formaldehyde. So many things that are taught in mortuary school that would be relevant to someone who never ever a day in their life after mortuary school embalms a body. They're not enemies, right? They're not in opposition of each other. This is a curriculum that really is for anybody, like I said a million times. But when it comes to the embalming, I think the people that are so anti-embalming have this idea of what it is or the attitude towards it in mortuary school. And that's really not it. That's really kind of coming from an ignorant place, or maybe, just anecdotal evidence that they heard from one person. But, it's interesting. I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and a very well-known person was the keynote speaker, and she said that mortuary schools only care about embalming. That's all they care about teaching. And this individual herself did not graduate from mortuary school, so I'm curious as to how she knows that, but that's okay. But and I made the point to her at that conference, mortuary school teaches embalming because it's required by the states that a person have it for licensure in many places. Mortuary school as a whole is not married to embalming inherently, but it's a part of the curriculum because it's what states require for licensure. So if you don't want people to have to learn embalming in mortuary school, what you've got to do then is have your states not require an embalming, national board or a degree, in embalming to be a funeral director. That's not us. That's coming from beyond us, It's like,
and also one of the things that which is where we derailed this in the first place is on paper it can look that way, but then you speak to the teachers and the teachers are like, oh, we're doing this and we're doing that and we're doing the other thing, and we make sure we hit the curriculum.
Look at the curriculum. Look at the classes. Embalming is one class out of like 15. Like, how could you say it's embalming focused when it's one class you have to take of like 15 or more classes? It just, again, to me, it's an ignorant statement based on assumptions or maybe some kind of anecdote from one person or two. And it's not really based in fact, but what it does is it continues to perpetuate this division within the bigger death care world that doesn't need to be there because of a lot of its assumptions and incorrect information.
That is fantastic. And you're not going to get the same question that I give to everybody else, because usually at the end of my interviews, I say, is there anything you had to say that I didn't give you a chance to? But we're going to skip that question. And we're going to move on to, because I did want to talk about grief, but we
Yeah.
are out of time, and we'll do it another time. But do you have any, because I know you speak on grief, do you have any upcoming speaking that you're doing on grief? Is there some place where people can find out
I'm doing a lot
about
of things.
your grief?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not speaking about that particularly. I am going to New York next week to speak about conscious capitalism and death care, which, if you don't know what conscious capitalism, it's a whole theology behind being ethical and profitable. And that's one thing we have shame about in funeral service is we feel like if we're profitable, we're unethical, but those two things can coexist. And so that presentation, oh my gosh, I can't remember the name of my own presentation. Isn't that terrible? But I do a lot of different ones. But I'm giving that in New York next week. And the focus of that is really the tenets of the framework of the conscious capitalism model, which I'm applying to funeral service to talk about how we can be profitable businesses, because we're small businesses, most of us. I'm a small business owner. If you don't make money, you don't exist. And we have to stop being ashamed of being business people, but how we can do that ethically and feel good about ourselves at the end of the day. Because if we're serving families the right way, it's okay to be a business person. And so that's actually a pretty popular one that I give a couple times a year. And then I have another one in New York, which is it's called Say This, Not That. It is just some language things that are helpful in all kinds of different scenarios, not just dealing with families, but dealing with employees, dealing with vendors, dealing with all kinds of things. So that one's coming up in New York next week as well. I have one at the end of the month that's a webinar with Continuing Vision, which is a CEU provider. That is the one where I talk about my individual story a little bit, but also it's called Transformative Times, and it's talking about how we as practitioners can be more inclusive with the LGBTQ community. Not only that, but their family members and the community at whole. And that's where I do get into my personal story about that and kind of the disenfranchisement of grief in that community, which is a big deal. And then I will be giving 2 webinars in hopefully over the summer. I don't have a date yet, or I might have a date yet and I forgot it. I think it's July, online. And that's going to be specifically for Colorado, but it'll be open to everyone in the nation. You'll see things about that through Continuing Vision as well, where I'm going to do a presentation. It's called Ethics in Funeral Service, a Colorado Case Study, where I talk specifically about the things that have happened here in Colorado and what we can learn from that from an ethical perspective as practitioners. And then I'm going to start doing some education about the FTC funeral rule and compliance with that, because again, in Colorado, having no license and having, having unenforced regulation for a long time. And just from things I know to be happening here and things I've seen, we need some education about how to be compliant with FTC. So I'm going to start doing that over the summer. I have a racial bias and death care class that I'll be hosting over the summer. That'll be with the grave woman Joelle, Simone Maldonado, and Anita Grant. They're going to educate us on how we have bias in the death care that we provide, and some microaggressions that we may not be aware that we are taking part in, especially when serving an African American community, if we're not an African American director. So those things are coming up, and then I've got a couple more. I'm almost done. And then in October, I'm going to be having a seminar with Emily Miller of the Green Burial Council, where she will educate us about all things green burial. We'll have some hands-on things that have to do with body care, shrouding, and those things. That'll be at my college. That'll be open to the public as well. So yeah, that's the things that come to top of mind for 2024, at least for the rest of it. So,
Fantastic.
yeah.
If I can find the links to them, I will put them in the
I'll
show
send them
notes.
to you when I have them. I'm really bad about remembering the exact dates of things, but all those things are coming up between now and October for me.
That is fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time and for talking to me about education. This was, I knew it was going to be a great conversation, and it was even better than I thought it was going to be. So thanks so much for your
You bet.
time.
Anytime. Thank you.
Funeral Service Insider, the podcast, is a Kates-Boylston production. It was written and edited by me, Tony Russo. I say it every week, and here's another week, so I'm going to say it again. Please make sure you check out the show notes, because that's where you can get in touch with us and leave feedback and get links to everything that we mentioned that's worth linking to in this week's episode. Also, please subscribe where you're listening now. We're available on Spotify, we're available on Apple Music, and we are available on Amazon. Pretty much any place you get podcasts, we are there because, well, we're a podcast. Now, for the postmortem. This week, I want to talk a little bit about covering the LGBTQIA plus community. We had a great speaker at the recent Kates-Boylston Funeral Service Business Plan Conference. It was June 4th and 5th, 2024, if you're listening in the future, in Warwick, Rhode Island, as I was informed after I got there. I'd been calling it Warwick. But anyway, one of the speakers was Jennifer Wright Berryman, who's been a guest on this show and who has also been featured in the FSI weekly newsletter. She's a professor of sociology at the University of Cincinnati, and she has a specialization in suicide. And I'll link to all of the things that we've talked about with her in the show notes. But one of the things that I didn't really publish that we spoke about was there's this kind of, oh, it's June, it's time to do a Pride style story kind of attitude, I think, in a lot of the media. I write about LGBTQIA plus issues all year. So do we in American Funeral Director and in American Cemetery and Cremation. We don't save it till June. I mean, you know, members of the Pride community are newsworthy 12 months a year. It's more about the story than making sure we get the coverage. And I'd been discussing that with her, kind of saying that it feels a little pandery sometimes to write a Pride type story in June. But one of the things I think we do really well here at KB is to make it a little bit more subtle in June, to not cover it. But when I talked to her about, you know, maybe just not worrying too hard about whether we're making the coverage in June, one of the things that she pointed out was it's important because we need to be seen to be supportive if we are supportive. And it's something that doesn't register a lot with, it certainly didn't register with me until we had this discussion. And I think it doesn't register with a lot of people, although I've been trying to do a better job covering it. I can't imagine being thrown out of a business. I'm a white guy with money. No one kicks me out of any place. And so I forget that if I'm a white gay guy with money, I can still get kicked out of places. And that's why it's important to just have a little sign that says, hey, we don't kick gay people out of our business. And yes, it is ridiculous that that's the kind of sign that we need in the 21st century, but there are maniacs out there who wish harm upon sexual and gender minorities. And it's not a question of figuring out why. It's just a question of making sure that you say out loud that you're not one of them, because otherwise they have to assume that you are, because I can't imagine what it would be like to be thrown out of a place. I said that. And how hurtful it would be. And it's easier to not go in a place than to worry about being thrown out. One of the things that came out of my conversations with Jennifer Wright Berryman is this idea that not having even just a little nod on your website is like having a sign saying we don't welcome you. And that isn't necessarily your fault. That is the fault of our culture. That is the fault of the way that we allow our culture to treat gender and sexual minorities. But that's all the more reason to step up and say, hey, look, I'm not a maniac. I'm not an idiot. I will serve literally everyone. I'm a professional. So just take a look at your website. Maybe if you don't have anything that indicates that you serve gender and sexual minorities, throw something on there. Otherwise, it's very much can be interpreted as a sign that you don't. And that'll do it for this episode. Thank you again so much for listening, and thank you for telling your friends to listen. And we will check in with you next time on Funeral Service Insider, the podcast.